Okay, food allergies. Food allergies, there's food allergies and intolerances. An allergy is an abnormal response to a food triggered by your body's own immune system. The body sees a protein in a food as a threat, and the immune system responds. Whereas an intolerance is just an unpleasant reaction to the food, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the immune system. So the symptoms could be gas, bloating, nausea, dizziness. So let's break those apart a little bit. Food allergies are relatively uncommon. Really, they only affect about 5% of children and only 3 to 4% of adults, even though it seems like a lot. But only about 12 million Americans have food allergies, but that number is increasing. So during the last decade, food allergies have become more common in children. Fortunately, most children outgrow them, especially allergies to milk, eggs, and soy. So, although only 8 foods account for 90% of all food-related allergic reactions, milk, eggs, peanut, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, wheat, and soy, a growing allergen consciousness is evidenced by the introduction of many new products created and labeled as allergen-free. Symptoms may be mild, like just a rash or watery eyes or headache, cramping, or severe, trouble breathing, wheezing, and even loss of consciousness. A severe or life-threatening allergic reaction happens when the airways actually swell closed and breathing becomes really blocked. That's called anaphylaxis or an anaphylactic shock and can cause death if a person's not treated immediately. Symptoms usually occur right away, but they may appear up to 2 hours after ingestion. So if there's any indication that a guest is having an allergic reaction, it's very critical to call 911 immediately. Also check to see if that person may be carrying a little pen-like device called an EpiPen. If so, it's important that the drug is administered immediately into the person's outer thigh because even trace amounts of an allergen can trigger reaction in these people that are very susceptible. So the only way to assure diners that a dish is safe is to know what's in it. So it's extremely important to educate staff. And when you think about it, cross-contamination is one of the leading causes of reactions in restaurants. So clean utensils and work surfaces thoroughly before using them to prepare food for an allergic guest. Be especially careful of things like cutting boards, slicers, and maybe other kitchen equipment that may have been used before an allergen-containing food. So it's a real critical thing for people who have an allergy, and hopefully they're very upfront about, mentioning that so that your staff can be very diligent about how to handle it. Food intolerance, on the other hand, people with food intolerance can eat minimal amounts of the food in question without experiencing major symptoms. And that's why, it varies greatly from person to person. So, like, for instance, if a person has lactose intolerance, they may be able to handle things like cheese or Greek yogurt, whereas a big whole glass of milk drunk, when you drink it on its own without any food can really maybe create some issues. So some of the key nutrition points here are, for a person with a food allergy, complete avoidance of that allergic ingredient is very critical. And it's important to read labels, especially ingredient labels. So that's why it's important to get all that information from vendors. Encourage diners with special needs to call ahead. People generally with food allergies are going to frequent certain restaurants because they can feel more comfortable that the restaurant's going to give them what they need. And that should be encouraged so that the chef can, check ingredients and make sure appropriate equipment and food preparation is done ahead of time. Be sure that the chef understands that foods for guests with allergies must be prepared using only the ingredients in the recipe directions. And again, you might have to be creative in making adjustments for different recipes. So, know what the ingredients are and make those adjustments accordingly. Diagnosing a food allergy begins with a thorough medical history to identify a suspected food, the amount that must be eaten to cause a reaction, and the amount of time between food consumption and development of the symptoms. So it's not something that a person should diagnose on their own. It should be a process, that's reviewed with a physician. A complete physical exam, select lab tests are usually conducted to rule out underlying medical conditions that may not even be related to the food allergy. And then, of course, several tests, such as skin testing and blood tests, are available to determine a person's immune system, if they're sensitive to a specific food. Once they're diagnosed, most food allergies are treated by avoidance of that allergen. Avoiding allergens is pretty easy to do at home. You read the labels when you're shopping, you use whole food, you know what you're preparing. Manufacturers must list each allergen by its recognizable name, such as milk instead of casein. If milk, for example, is not identified in the ingredient list in the label, it must state that it contains milk. So, everybody's working together on making the best possible experience for these types of clients. These foods account for 90% of all the different allergies. So we're going to see more allergies with milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, soy, and also wheat. Most cases of allergic reactions are mild, but some can be violent. Just a review. And again, training is so important with the staff. So, as a culinary professional, you're getting the information, but when you're dealing with, changeover in staff, because, the industry has such a high turnover rate, it's important to really, emphasize the importance of people understanding that if they serve someone a salad that has peanuts and find out that that person's allergic to peanuts, they can't go in the back and just remove the peanuts. They have to start over because there's going to be some residue on the other ingredients that can potentially cause even a fatality. How do you create a management plan? As a culinary professional, there are steps you can take to create a food allergy management plan to assist customers. And it's important to do this ahead of time. So who will answer the guest questions? Someone has to be designated at all hours of operation to discuss allergy concerns with customers. It's not okay for a customer to say, "Does that have such and such ingredient?" And the server says, "I don't know." It's really important to have, a good communication so that the chef is able to make the item prepared correctly to not have the allergen. Who's going to be responsible for keeping recipe information up to date and checking ingredients used in menu items? It sounds easy enough to get all that set up, but what happens if you change vendors for some of those ingredients? Or maybe something has to be substituted in because you can't get the normal ingredient. See, all this trickle-down effect affects the customer in a really big way when they have a food allergy. What steps do the kitchen and waitstaff take to avoid cross-contamination? It's important to think about that. And how is your staff going to handle an allergic reaction? Hopefully somebody is there with a clear head so that, you can remain, calm during those situations. The prevalence of food allergies is growing, so we must all take them very seriously. All staff need training in the nature of food allergies. So, again, some of the staff may come in thinking it's not that critical or that somebody's trying to be an alarmist and making a point, but it's very critical in the part of training that chefs, cooks, front of the house, back of the house really understands the importance of this. There's some pages in your textbook, page 352 to 355, and there's a lot of different lists of foods to avoid for different food allergies. So I'd really like for you to get familiar with those, and you're going to have a head start on really understanding the importance of all this. Egg allergies. So strictly avoiding eggs and food containing eggs and egg products is really the only way to prevent a reaction. Think about all the things that have eggs in them. It's not easy to avoid these products because of many unexpected products that have them. Like egg yolks are sometimes used to glaze baked items like pretzels or bagels, or maybe it's used as a foaming agent in beer or lattes or cappuccinos. So if there's an egg allergy, things like angel food cake, cholesterol-free egg substitutes, cream pies, French toast, hollandaise sauce, mayonnaise, meringues, pancakes, puddings, souffles, all have eggs in them. So, when you're dealing with this type of allergy, again, you have to have those ready-made ideas ahead of time. You can't think on your feet. You have to have a plan in action. So some of the tips for chefs would be substituting mashed avocados, mustard, hummus, red pepper spread, or tapenade for mayonnaise on sandwiches. Or use tofu instead of eggs for a breakfast scramble. So lots of things you can use, just maybe a little different than what we normally use. Peanut allergies can trigger really severe reactions if people are very sensitive. And some of the more unexpected sources of peanuts would be like your Asian and Mexican dishes, sauces like pesto, gravy. Think about it. If a person's not a cook or not into food, they have no idea what goes into certain items. And then, of course, you can see other names like beer nuts, ground nuts, goobers, monkey nuts. Those all, identify peanuts, but people may not think about that. So when it comes to a peanut allergy, exposure can occur in 3 different ways. It could be direct contact, cross contact, and also inhalation. So if it's direct contact, that's the most common exposure, and that's eating peanuts or peanut-containing foods. Sometimes even just direct skin contact with peanuts can trigger that reaction. Cross contact makes sense. The unintended introduction of peanuts into a product is generally the result of exposure during processing or maybe even handling of a food product. So, if peanuts are used in a manufacturing situation, there might be some airborne, peanuts that are contaminating other food. So it's just really something to think about. And then inhalation, an allergic reaction can even occur if dust or aerosols containing peanuts is inhaled, like peanut flour or peanut oil, cooking spray. So again, these are very serious things that people need to take to heart. Some of the foods commonly containing peanuts are like African cooking, Chinese, Indonesian, Thai, Vietnamese, and also some Mexican dishes. Sauces, I mentioned pesto, gravy, mole sauce, peanut sauce, artificial nuts like peanuts reflavored as pecans or walnuts, baked goods, chocolate candy, peanut brittle, egg rolls, foods that contain extruded, cold pressed, or expelled peanut oil, which contains some peanut protein. Ice cream can have nuts. So there's just a lot of areas where peanuts are contained, even salad dressings. What about tree nuts? Tree nuts include things like almonds, Brazil nuts, cashews, chestnuts, coconuts, filberts, ginkgo nuts, hickory nuts. You can read them. But peanuts aren't included here because they're more of a legume. They're grown underground. So some of the unexpected sources of tree nuts would be like pasta, honey, breadings, salads and dressings, some of your meat-free alternatives. So, again, some of the foods that are commonly contain tree nuts could be things like barbecue sauce, um, what else? Mortadella, may contain pistachios, pancake mixes, pie crust. So it's, again, to read labels is very, very critical. How about milk allergy? They're most common in young children who usually outgrow it as they get older. But, some of your hidden sources of milk, which you don't think about, would be like luncheon meats that are sliced on slicers that also are used to slice cheese. So many of the stores have designated cheese slicers to try to avoid some of that problem. And then again, if a person has a milk allergy, they're going to avoid dairy products and caseinate, ghee, lactoalbumin, lactose, lactulose, and also whey. So those are all things that indicate milk that can create a problem for a person with a milk allergy. Same thing with a soy allergy. Soybean allergy is one of the more common food allergies, especially in infants and children. And that's why a lot of times, doctors will put babies on different infant formulas if they're not breastfeeding and try different things if they have diarrhea and other digestive, symptoms from their formula. Soybeans appear in a number of processed foods and can be really hard to avoid. Soy products are in baked goods, crackers, cereal, soups, salad dressings, etc. So, again, label reading is especially important. Now, wheat-free diet. Wheat allergy is not the same as having celiac disease, which requires a gluten-free diet. Children are the ones that are most likely to have that wheat allergy. And it's really hard to avoid it because you have to read labels very carefully, and it's found in a lot of places that you don't expect it, like lunch meat and french fries. Shellfish, most people don't outgrow this one. This can be a more serious one, more of a lifelong problem. And it includes not only shrimp, but crab, crayfish, lobster, mollusks, clams, oysters, scallops, etc. So it really involves a lot more than just shrimp. We're going to move on now to gluten-free, which we talked about a lot in the baking gluten-free chapter. So this will be hopefully a review. But celiac disease is, again, an inherited autoimmune disease. So when a person with celiac consumes any food or beverage or medication that contains any form of gluten, their immune system is triggered and it responds by damaging the lining of the intestinal tract. So they're going to have obvious symptoms of abdominal pain, diarrhea, sometimes severe skin rash. Other people without celiac disease also have GI symptoms after eating gluten. And instead of celiac disease, it can be called gluten sensitivity. So it's not like a full-blown inherited autoimmune disease, but they do carry some problem of dealing with the gluten. So it's more of a sensitivity. And like we mentioned in the last couple chapters, gluten is found in wheat, barley, rye, and then of course oats, unless they're labeled gluten-free. So again, like any other allergy issue, it's so important to read food labels and understand where the gluten may be hidden. It could come from wheat, and look at all the different kinds of potential wheat items: durum wheat, farina, gram flour, wheat bran, semolina, kamut, and also spelt. And then again, your barley, rye, triticale, which is actually a cross between wheat and rye. And then oats generally don't have gluten, but many times they're processed in manufacturing plants that do have wheat flour. So they may be cross-contaminated with gluten. Then again, there's malt, as in barley malt extract. There's brewer's yeast, which a lot of Vegetarians use for a source of B12, dextrin, and modified food starch. So it's extremely important to read food labels. So that's why a person that has celiac is usually very anxious about eating out and their food choices. So the gluten in wheat, rye, and barley is essential for bread to rise, but people with celiac disease have to avoid it. So there's a challenge for you to really experiment to get the right product using alternative flours. So if someone is avoiding gluten, the answer is really having more of a whole food diet, whole grains. And then for thickeners, instead of wheat flour, you can use potato starch, tapioca starch, arrowroot, and even some cornstarch. Some of those gluten-free flours are a real challenge because they don't provide the same structure and elasticity that you get from using gluten. So baked goods, have to have other additional ingredients to stabilize their shape and consistency, and then they many times don't have the shelf life. So some of the stabilizers that you've probably even used in class are guar gum and xanthan gum. So the staples in a gluten-free diet, again, to reiterate, are just more of the whole food, food from the earth. And there they are. Chefs have to constantly avoid cross contact of gluten-free foods with gluten in the kitchen and also the dining room. So I think we've driven this point home enough to really show you the importance and what people have to deal with when they have special needs. So it's just not that they're trying to be annoying, it's very serious. If a person is needing something like low lactose or vegetarian, again, it's lactose, like we talked about in our carbohydrate chapter. When a person has lactose intolerance, they're missing an enzyme called lactase, and it's not allowing them to split down the milk sugar, which is called the lactose, into smaller components so that it's utilized. So many times the lactose goes into the large intestine and it attracts a lot of water, and that's why a person that has this problem, it causes bloating and also diarrhea. The concern is that a lot of people self-diagnose, and there may be many times, situations where if you were to talk to your doctor, maybe it wouldn't necessarily be a problem with lactose intolerance, or maybe you can tolerate a little bit of it. So it's important to, find a list that has how much lactose is in various foods. So, there's a lot of ways to manage this. When a person has lactose intolerance, they can include some, foods that have lactose, but there's a lot of lactose-free milk and milk products out there. So there's no reason to eliminate that food group because you still need the calcium and vitamin D and protein that the milk product has. But lactose-free milk is basically, it provides you with the enzyme that helps your body break down the lactose. Generally, yogurt made with live bacteria and also hard cheeses are usually better tolerated than some of your processed cheeses. And then that brings us to the topic of vegetarian. In your module, there's a handout called Becoming Vegetarian that I'd really like for you to use as a resource for learning a little bit more about the vegetarian lifestyle. The number of people interested in vegetarian diets is becoming, a lot more common, and it's people are increasing in their interest in trying to understand what it is. Instead of eating traditional meat entrees, vegetarians dine on main dishes that emphasize more legumes, such as dried beans and peas, grains, and vegetables. So it's more of a plant-based diet. There's different kinds of vegetarians. There are the lacto-ovo vegetarians, there are lacto-vegetarians, and then there are vegans, and also some in between. The lacto-ovo vegetarian means that they can eat dairy and eggs. Lacto meaning dairy, ovo meaning egg. If a person is lacto-vegetarian, they may eat dairy but no eggs at all. And then vegans are the more strict of the bunch. They do not eat eggs or dairy and rely exclusively on plant products that meet their protein and other nutrient needs. So think about it. When you're eliminating an entire food group, meal planning is essential to get all the nutrients that you need. There's also a few others like pescatarian, which, they eliminate a lot of their meat protein except for adding in some seafood. So there's different types of vegetarian. Vegan is the most strict. Vegan is also, I don't even call it a diet. It's really more of a lifestyle, because people who are vegan also generally very interested in animal welfare and where foods come from, and also not utilizing products in their daily life that come from an animal or that are tested on animals, like for instance makeup or toiletries. So it's really a much more diligent, strict approach to eating in a lifestyle. And really, anyone can be on a vegetarian diet. A lot of people think that it's not healthy for children or women who are pregnant, but it absolutely is. But the most critical thing is proper meal planning. Because, like I've mentioned before, when you're eliminating food groups, you are eliminating nutrients that can't be made up adequately in, another food group. So meal planning is especially critical. Most vegetarians don't have a problem getting protein. And when you look and compare, the vegetarian diets are generally lower in fat because they're not getting all that meat. So lower in fat and saturated fat because they're not getting the meat, the highly fatted meat. They're not getting the whole milk, high-fat snacks that might have those in it. So when you're consuming more plant proteins, think about it. You're getting all the nutrients, but you're also getting a whole lot more fiber than someone who is a meat and potatoes type person. So when we talked about the protein chapter, we discussed a little bit about complementary proteins. And that's exactly the basis for a vegetarian diet is when you eliminate meat, you have to eat a variety of plant foods throughout the day so that the amino acids in each of those plant foods actually complement one another. And like I mentioned in the protein chapter, basically we eat this way. So we normally have, legumes with our grains, like refried beans on a tortilla, or cornbread and pinto beans for dinner, or falafel on a whole wheat pita, or a peanut butter sandwich. See, all those things are very common in our diet already. So I want you to understand what a complementary protein is, but from the standpoint of meal planning, we just normally do it. Hummus is ground sesame seeds and chickpeas. So the proteins in both of those foods are definitely going to complement one another. When you have whole wheat macaroni and cheese, you're complementing proteins. So this chart here is really just a review from our protein chapter that when we were discussing the amino acids. And besides the plant food, there's a lot of meat alternatives out there. They're usually soy-based or vegetable-based proteins. They, have a meat-like texture, and generally they're not super expensive, and generally they're fortified with different nutrients that you're missing when you eat meat. So there's a lot of, alternatives out there, and I highly recommend, because you're in the profession, that it's important to know what they are and try them out and see, if you like them so that you can have an opinion about using them. There's even some, more common meat alternatives like a burger made out of beans that actually has a bloody feature. So when you take a bite out of the meat alternative, the hamburger in quotations, when you take a bite, it'll appear like it's bleeding. So, what are the guidelines for vegetarian meals? Again, variety, variety, variety. Use a variety of different kind of protein sources. Eat a lot more vegetables. Choose low fat and fat free varieties of milk, soybean based products. Always think about other cuisines because a lot of other cuisines do it well in terms of, plant based foods. And then avoid foods that may contain animal products that you don't even think about, like gelatin or marshmallows, certain candies. So be creative. It's there's a lot out there, and people who are following a vegetarian diet, they deserve just as much as everybody else flavorful, wonderful, textured food that is also healthy. When you think about vegan diets, it's really going a step further in terms of not including any of the dairy. So there are things like soy yogurt. Now, many times people don't realize that some of these are more processed foods and they are going to have more sodium and things. But if a vegan sticks to a whole food diet, you generally get, a really healthy options. So instead of using an egg, which would be an animal protein, you could use energy egg replacers, or even mixing a little bit of water with ground up flaxseed can potentially give you some egg-like replacer. So in summary, chefs and culinary professionals prepare foods in a variety of operations, from healthcare facilities to schools to fine dining restaurants. People with special dietary needs are dining every day in all of these settings, just like healthy people, just like other, people who have no special needs. This chapter looked at key nutrition points, best food choices, foods to limit, and also some tips on how they could serve guests who are living with various allergies. So be prepared to serve these guests requires that you plan your meals and menus around healthy principles. Offer a variety of choices, keep your portions reasonable, and be open and willing to train staff to serve guests with special health needs. You won't regret it. Thank you.